In the book of Deuteronomy, the 25th chapter, the 28th and 29th verses, we have the following statement. And the Lord heard the voice of your words when you spake unto me. And the Lord said unto me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people, which they have spoken unto thee. They have well said all that they have spoken. Oh, that there were such an heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. For your own good is our subject. For your own good. During the Black History Month, because of the emphasis that the church placed on the Black History Month and the special presentations and material in the bulletin, I decided to do some things that I had considered for the last several years. And one of the things that I decided to do was to preach more sermons and do more lectures, or to include in more sermons and in more of my lectures some of the wisdom that was apparent in the black community before integration. To share with people some of the wise and good things about black culture before integration. And the sermon last Sunday, God Don't Like Ugly, was based upon one of those statements. And today's message also harkens back to a statement that I heard frequently when I was growing up. For your own good. The people at that time believed that if you understood that something was for your own good, that you ought to do it. In fact, they used to say, even a fool will do things for his own good. And sometimes when you were acting up in church, they'd look at you and say, if you knew what was good for you, you would straighten up. So this expression, for your own good, was something that I grew up hearing. And this statement is very, very profound. For your own good, that everybody ought to do things for his or her own good. I have probably told you before, and maybe even more times than you wanted to hear, that I was seen by many as the most influential teacher at my school. I could get kids to do things that no one else at the school could talk them into doing. I was not a principal. I could not expel them. I could not do any of the things that some of the other people could do to them to make them do anything. Yet, according to them, I had more influence than any of the people at the school. Now, I suppose that if you don't have certain things going for you, you have to develop other things. For example, since I had no children of my own, I could never make this statement, I'm your daddy, so do it because I'm your daddy. I didn't learn to say that. Since I was not bigger than the kids, because I taught high school children, they were bigger than I was, I couldn't say to them, I'll beat you up because I'm bigger and stronger than you are. So some of the things and techniques that other folks use, I couldn't use them. So I had to find another way to get kids to do what they should do. Now, you think that I'm making some of this up. I want to read to you a letter that I got from a student a few days ago. And I get these all the time. It says, Mr. Jenkins, I happened to stumble onto your webpage this morning. I wanted to take a minute to thank you for the influence you were on my life. As my 20-year reunion approaches, I have been reminiscing about past teachers and friends. Mr. Jenkins, you were a teacher in the truest sense of the word. You taught us English, but more importantly, you taught us about life. You taught me that there is much more to the world outside of West St. Louis County. You made me understand what a privilege it is to be reared in an affluent suburb. I may have taken that privilege for granted back then, but I certainly do not today. I have vivid memories of being called out in class along with, and then he goes on and names several of the other students. I am sure that all would agree that you had more influence on our lives than any other teacher. Now, I finally figured out why I had influence on those students' lives. Now, this is not just a black teacher and the black children running to the teacher. No, most of these schools are not even black. This young man who wrote this email is not black. Most of my students were white, actually. So I figured out why I had the influence. And it's rooted in this particular statement. I had the influence because, one, my only interest in people has always been what was good for them. I had no interest in other people except what was in their best interest. And I learned how to explain that to them in a way that they believed it. My interest in them was them. What was best for them? What was good for them? What was in their best interest? Because I believe that the people who said you ought to do that which is for your own good were very accurate. You ought to do what is for your own good. That sounds simple. That sounds marvelous. If you knew how difficult that was to get people to do, you would have a greater appreciation for preachers, teachers, social workers, parents, and anybody who works for young people or works with young people. I have a friend who lives in Columbia, Missouri. I've known him since he was about 21 or 22 years old when I first met him. Now he's in his late 50s. He is retired and he's doing well. And one of the reasons he's doing well is because in his city they had a program that they allowed employees to participate in, and that the city would match dollar for dollar the employee's contribution up to a certain amount of money. And he participated. And toward the end of his career, he was appointed a supervisor. And as a supervisor, he advised young people coming into the job. And he would see young black men hired by the city who were offered the opportunity to participate in this program. And many of them would not. So as a black man who knew how important it was and how happy he was that he had participated, he would pull them off to the side and talk to them and try to get them to participate, to put up this money that the city was going to match. And it was difficult for him to do it. And he would say to me, Reverend Jenkins, I don't understand why people wouldn't do that. It is for their own good. It's for their own good. If doctors could get people to do things for their own good, we could lower the health care costs in this country overnight. If doctors could get us to eat right and to exercise, and even after we've developed illnesses, to actually monitor our illnesses and take our medicine, we would lower health costs in America tremendously for our own good. If teachers could get children, if teachers could get black children to study their lessons the way they are capable of studying and the way they ought to study, we wouldn't have an achievement gap in America anything near what we have today. For your own good. If parents can get their beautiful, intelligent daughters to stay away from these no good boys that mean them no good, we could solve many of our family problems today. Now, some old lady back in Mississippi is now, Reverend Jenkins, you stop preaching, going to meddling now. But meddling is preaching. So if we could get, isn't it frustrating? Isn't it painful? Isn't it agonizing and heartbreaking to not be able to get people to do things that you know are in their own good? Well, did you know that the 10 Commandments were given to people not for God, but for their own good? Their statement that I read to you in Deuteronomy comes after the 10 Commandments. It's about the 10 Commandments. And it is saying, God is saying to the people, these commandments were given to them not because I want to be praised, not that I want to be elevated, not that I want to be made feel good, but these laws are given to them for their own good. You know, the fact that the churches are not full today is an indication that people are crazy or preachers have not been as effective as they need to be in telling people that it is for their own good. You know, the fact that this young man would write me 20 years after being in my class of what I did for him, and I can stand and preach in a community where folks need me more than this kid ever did. This boy was wealthy and was going to do well probably had I not come into his life or not. But to have folks who need what I know more than he needed it, ignore it. And this young man, and the rest of this letter tells you about what he's doing now, how successful he is. It's very, very frustrating. Because it is for for their own good. And somehow we have not convinced people how valuable God's word is for them, how valuable the commandments are to them, and how much better their lives would be if they would come to understand that all of this is for them and their own good. Now, it's actually a wonderful thing when you think about it. That is, we've been begging people to come to the church. We're begging people to do this and begging people to do that. That's really not the way it ought to be. Folks ought to be begging us to get in here. Folks ought to be packed, standing. If this was a concert, if there's anybody, let me tell you something. And I don't like to boast, but I don't mind telling people honestly what my accomplishments are. There are very few people who can do what they do any better than I do what I do. Now, I don't mean just preaching. I'm talking about the kind of lectures that I do. There are very few people who do them any better. Now, I'm as good at what I do as any professional basketball player is at what they do. I'm as good at what I do as any professional baseball player is at what they do. I do not fail nearly as many times on stage as the greatest hitter on the Cardinals team fail at the bat. But if one of them would come here and announce that they were going to be here, even on daylight saving time day starting, folks would have been lined up to get in the door. This morning, what time is he going to be here? They'd have been in line. I go sometime by the Fox Theater, and I say, have people lost their mind? People are lined up to get in to see some kind of show. And I think, have people lost their minds? And here I am talking about the word of life. Here I am talking about something that's going to save people from frustration, from heartache, from misery, and maybe even from hell. Then you have to beg people to come for their own good. You know, and I really have a difficult time bothering people too much about coming to church. Because I just work with people for what they want. What I do is I help people to achieve what they want. And if people don't want the church, I don't really bother them that much. I'm not as evangelistic as I ought to be, I think. I probably should bother people a little bit more. But I tell people sometimes, well, if you want to go to hell, that's your business. But I shouldn't be that way. I should beg them more and bother them. But it's hard for me to beg somebody when what I have is better than what they have. It's hard for me to beg somebody to straighten out their lives. It's hard for me to beg somebody when I'm doing just fine whether they come or not. But it's frustrating. Because we have not made the convincing argument that this is for the people's good. And that's the argument this Moses was making in the scripture. It is for your good. It is so that it will go well with you. It is not so that God will be happier. It is because you will be better off. So my thing as a preacher is actually to offer God to people. And this particular scripture, Moses was talking about the principles of God, the laws of God. That is all for your good. And you know, really, when you live long enough to see what has happened as a result of things that happened, you have a greater understanding of life if you just only see things happening. Now, I know that sounds confusing. when you live long enough to see what happened, because or as a result of things that happened, you have wisdom and insight if you can put all of this together. I have lived long enough to see what happened to 16-year-olds who did certain things at 16. I have seen them at 30, at 40, and at 50. So when I say it is for your own good, I'm not just talking about something I read in the scriptures. I'm talking about what I've seen in the lives of people who adopted certain principles by which they lived their lives. So here in this scripture, when it says for your so that it will go well with you, Moses is saying to people that if you follow these rules, your life is going to be better. Your life is going to be better. And what I'm saying to you is that I have lived long enough to see people who followed the rules and people who didn't. I don't just have to go by the scriptures. I can go by my observation. Our young people who are in college, I could say something now that if I had said to college kids when they were in college or high school, they wouldn't have believed it. But you see, I've been working with college kids since I was a college kid myself. And I know that the kids who study their lesson in high school and go to college with a good high school education have a much better time in college than the kids who mess around in high school and ignore everything. Because if you get a good high school education, you can really party in college. Now, don't go and party too much, but you can party sometime. But if you didn't get a good high school education, you are trying to catch up, learn in college what you should have learned in high school, and you're always behind. And I think that we are not emphasizing high school education enough. We should stop telling you, oh, you're going to learn it in college. No, you need to learn it in high school. Most of the stuff I talk about in the pulpit and most of the things I talk about on the stages of colleges and universities, I learned them in high school first. So when you live, you can see the result of things. See this young man that wrote that letter? He has lived 20 years since I told him some of the things that I told him. And he probably wondered at that time, how did I know what I was talking about? Well, here's how I know. He wasn't the first 16-year-old I'd worked with. I had been working with children probably before he was born. And what I told him was what I learned from them. What I told him is what I learned from the rest of them. I know that those who live by the principles of God do better than those who don't. That's not just something I read in the Bible. It is something that I have seen in life. And I work, I talk all the time about I work with young people. Well, I work with church people. And church people are not just young people. And when I say I work with young people, I simply mean that I started working with them when they were young. Some of the people I worked with when they were young, almost as old as I am. You saw when you went up to Columbia, some of those people were 50 years old. I worked with them when they were kids. So I have seen what has happened to the folks who followed the principles, and I have seen what has happened to the folks who didn't. So when I say to people, you ought to choose God's principles for your life, that is not something that I want folks to do for God. It is something that I want them to do for themselves so that it will go well with you. It is for your own good. When I tell people that you ought to seek God's purpose for your life, it is not to help God. It is for your own good. because I have seen people who used up their lives in all kinds of stupid, silly, senseless, wasteful pursuits. And I have seen what has happened to them as they came toward the evening of their lives. Now, this is what I really wish that the men had been here today. I was going to say this, and they're not here. It's kind of like the man in the bucket of slop. And you say, why tell us? Well, I got to do something with it. Maybe you'll tell them. Here's why, and I'm glad, the men have started coming. And they'll be back next Sunday, hopefully. But what I was going to tell the men is that the reason that I bother them about coming to church has nothing to do with me. It is not that I want them to hear me preach. I was preaching on radio in 14 southern states before I was 30 years old. By the time I was 30, I had preached to more people than most folks do in their lifetime. I lecture all over the country. People read my books and stuff on the internet. So I really don't need folks to come to this church to hear me preach. Now, here's why I asked them to come. If they knew how many pathetic, sorry, messed up, mixed up black men I know who are 45 and 50 who left the church, they would know why I want them to come. It had nothing to do with me. If they knew how many folk I know who I am the only person they know who have the same telephone number that they had when they met them, who always have a car and gas to go somewhere. If they know how many black men I know who don't have family, don't have community friends, don't have a church that they belong to, if they knew that, how many people that I go to see in the hospital, black men, that I am the only person who goes to see them. And I don't go because of anything that they've done. I go because of what I am. If they knew the young men that I've watched grow up, and the ones who've left the church and the ones who stay, and if they knew the difference in their lives, they'd come to church every Sunday. If they knew that almost all the young men who leave the church when they're youthful and healthy and have something to contribute go out into the world and is washed up and used up, and at some point in their lives, just before their deathbed that claims them, they come dragging back to the church when they're too old and sickly to do anything but get their funeral fixed up. Well, they're not here, so... But you tell them what I said. I'm going to make a tape of it. That's why I bothered them about coming to church. I don't want them to be like that. I don't want them to go out and use up their lives in riotous living. I don't want them in and out of jail, in and out of prison, in and out of drug treatment programs, in and out of homeless shelters, being fed by people who make their living providing crutches for black cripples. How did I get into this? Y'all don't want to deal with daylight saving time and this all on the same Sunday. But, I know this stuff, so you have to tell it to somebody. So I don't want that to happen to the young men in your families. I don't want that to happen to the young men in this church. So I tell them, come to church, stay with the church. Because Jesus will provide an anchor for you as you walk through the difficult paths of life. He'll be there for you and with you, and he will see you through it and keep you safe from it. That's why I want them to come. Because I have seen what has happened to folks who left. I've seen what kind of existence they've had. And then I guess ultimately, I've seen what has happened to me. And I stayed. And I hear people who stayed come down toward the end of their lives. And one of the things that they say is that when they look back over their lives, the thing that they find most consistent and the thing that they find most precious is that Jesus was a part of their lives. You know, one of the interesting things about God, it's easier to look back and see what God has done than it is to look out and see what he's doing. It's easier to look back and see what God has done than it is to look out and see what he's doing. When you're in college, struggling and trying to get through, it's not easy to see what God is doing. When you got a young family and ripping and running to match up schedules and stuff with husband and wife and stuff, it's not easy to see what God is doing. When I was teaching at school, and then catching a plane on Friday, rushing to the airport and flying off to somewhere else to speak, and then getting back to go to work, it was not easy to see what God was doing. When I was selling my books out of the trunk of my car, it was not easy to see what God was doing. But now, when I look back and see what God did, I can tell folks what good things has come from sticking with God's program. For your own good, you ought to stick with Jesus. For your own good, you ought to stay with the church. For your own good, you ought to follow the principle. For your own good, you ought to follow the purposes. And if you can't see it yourself right now, trust those of us who've been there. Trust those of us who've been there for your own good.